As we've been going through the Mishnah of Pesachim, we've been noticing that the Mishnah is continually referencing other korbanot. So, in other words, the issues about, we know that the Pesach is a korban. Of course, we know that. But the Mishnah is perpetually referencing questions of hametz and matzah against other kinds of offerings. It's a theme that runs through the Masachet. And today we're going to look at a definition of the kinds of grains which can be used to make matzah. And we're going to find, by the way, that the grains that can be used for matzah are the same grains that can be used for hametz, and actually the same that can be used for hallah. And I just want to remind you, so I thought I would remind you just to start off with, of a Mishnah in hallah, which we learned a few months ago. Hamisha devarim hayavim ba hallah. 5 different species are subject to hallah. And then there's a list. Wheat, barley, it's spelled oats and rye. These are the 5 famous grains for which the land of Israel is famous, and they're subject to hallah. And by the way, the Mishnah in hallah then goes on to mention Pesach. The second Mishnah in hallah goes on to say, "Ha'ochel mehem kazait matzah b'Pesach." If you eat an olive-sized quantity of them on Pesach, yatzah yadechovatzah, you fulfilled your obligation. And then kazait hametz chayav b'hikaret. If an olive-sized piece of hametz, one is liable for karet, for cutting off, whatever that means. So the Mishnah in hallah essentially articulates this triangle between hallah, hametz, and matzah. And this triangle is based around the 5 species. So as we go back to our Mishnah of Pesachim, we're going to come back to this. We're going to come back to this triangle, and we're going to find a copy in the Mishnah Pesachim of this list. And there is a pasuk, by the way, for this in Devarim. We have a pasuk, lo tuchal alav hametz, you shouldn't eat anything leavened on it. This is eating with the Pesach sacrifice. Lo tuchal alav hametz, you shouldn't eat hametz. Shivat yamim tuchal alav matzot, 7 days you eat unleavened bread. Again, in the Torah, we have this parallelism between hametz and matzah. They go together, hametz and matzah. So let's have a look at the Mishnah now. We're in Mishnah 5, the 5th Mishnah of the 2nd chapter. And it's a copy of the Mishnah that we just read in Challah. Eilu dvarim she'adam yotzeh b'hem yedei chovato b'Pesach. And here's the list. B'chitim b'sorim b'kusmin b'shifon uv'shibolet she'ur. These are the things that they fulfill their obligation with on Pesach, with wheat, with barley, with spelt, with rye, and with oats. And then the Mishnah is going to investigate the type of ownership, the type of ownership, the status, let's say the halachic status of these things. Veyotzin, bidmai, uvmaser rishon, shenitla truma, uvmaser sheni, vehekdesh shenifdu, and that people fulfill the obligation with demai. That's food that we bought from an am haaretz, from someone who doesn't take tithes carefully, and let's say it's doubtfully tithed. It's doubtfully tithed. I mean, strictly speaking, we need to re-tithe it, but it's a derabanan, so we can fulfill the mitzvah with it. With first tithe, whose truma has been separated. So this is Maser Rishon. It's been given to a Levi, and the Trumat Maaser, the special truma that the Levi separates for the Kohen's been separated, and with Maaser Sheni, or sanctified property that's been redeemed, because once we redeemed it, we can fulfill our obligations. And by the way, priests can fulfill their obligation with Challah and Truma. They are Kohanim b'Challah uvi Truma, because priests can obviously they can eat Challah and Truma, so they can fulfill their obligation with Challah and Truma. But not with untithed produce or with first tithe whose truma has not been separated, or with second tithe or sanctified property that's not been redeemed. And that's a copy, by the way, of the list that we learned a few weeks ago in Eruvin. Look, in Eruvin, we were talking at the beginning of the 3rd chapter. We were talking about the kinds of things that we could make an eruv out of. Remember, we learned that the eruv is the food that we share in order to establish the eruv. It's not the string around the city, it's the food. And exactly the same Mishnah, they make an eruv with demai, with first tithe from which truma has been taken, with second tithe, with concentrated food that's been redeemed, priests with hallah and truma. We've seen this Mishnah in Eruvin. And now, with regard to the food that we can use to make an eruv, and now we're seeing exactly the same Mishnah in Pesahim for the food that we can use to fulfill our obligation with. And then at the end of the Mishnah in Eruvin, remember there's a discussion about agency. Can you send your eruv in the hands of someone who doesn't really have capacity, the deaf, mute, the imbecile, or the minor? And in Pesachim, we're going to segue off into not so much it is still a question of agency and intent, but in a slightly different direction. So we segue off into the question of intent and agency, but in a different direction. So halot todah rukike nazir, loaves of thanksgiving offerings and loaves that have been made for a nazir offering. So these are all going to be matzah, by the way. If they've been made for a Todah offering or for a Nazirite offering, we can't use them because they've already been dedicated for a different purpose. If they've been dedicated for a different purpose, we can't use them to fulfill the mitzvah of eating matzah on Erev Pesach. But if he made them to sell in the market, then we can fulfill our obligation with them. The Gemara assumes that someone who makes food to sell in the market doesn't really make it for a specific purpose, but assumes it might be used for multiple purposes. And the Gemara is going to explain, the Gemara in Pesachim, this is the Jerusalem Talmud, the Talmud Yerushalmi, is going to explain in Pesachim this parallelism between the hallah, the matzah, and the hametz. Amar Rabbi Mana said, Azil to Caesarea. I went to Caesarea, as one does, as we still do. And I heard Rabbi Ahava ben Zaor, who said, this is Rabbi Ahava now saying, he said, my father said, in the name of Rabbi Ishmael, and now he's going to bring a Gezerah Shabbat, Ne'mar lechem b'Pesach, v'ne'mar lechem b'Challah. Bread, the word bread, lechem, is mentioned in the context of Pesach, and the word bread, lechem, is mentioned in the context of Challah. And we could look at the Pesukim if we had time. Then he goes on to say, Ma lechem shenemar b'Pesach davar shehu ba lidei matzah, just as the bread which is mentioned for Passover is something that can be either matzah or chametz. Shehu ba lidei matzah vechametz. Af lechem shenemar b'challah davar shehu ba lidei matzah vechametz. Similarly, the bread which is mentioned in the context of challah is something that could be either matzah or chametz. These three things, they all go together. And now he explains, uvadku, and they checked, umatzu she'ein lach balidei matzah, umatzu she'ein lach ba lidei matzah v'chametz, eila chameshet haminim bilvad. Only these 5 kinds of grain are the only 5 kinds that can be both matzah and chametz. These are the only 5 kinds of grain that can be made matzah and chametz. Ushar kol haminim, other kinds of grain, einan ba'in lidei matzah. They don't make matzah vechametz or chametz. Eila lidei sirchon. They just become spoiled. We talked about this before, that the idea that, of course, if you have your matzah you just made your matzah, but you leave it hanging around too long, it becomes hametz. Yeah, hametz is a bit like matzah that's been left hanging around too long, just like leftover sacrifices, which become forbidden, are kosher sacrifices that have been left lying around too long. Yeah, hametz is something is something that was holy, but it's been left lying around too long, and this is the essentially the equation. This is the equation which the Gemara seems to be circling around when it brings out the triangle of hametz, of matzah, and of hallah. And the Mishnah then goes on, having discussed what you can eat to fulfill your obligation for matzah on Erev Pesach. It's then going to go on to talk about the obligation of herbs. And of course, there's another pasuk. There are famous pasuk, which comes in the Haggadah. They'll eat the meat on that night. This is the Pesach sacrifices. Sli'eshu matzot, roasted, and matzot. Al murorim yochluhu. They will eat it on bitter herbs. So the matzot and the bitter herbs go together, and our Mishnah that says, look, these are the 5 kinds of grain that you can use to fulfill your obligation of matzah, is then paralleled with the Mishnah that says, look, these are the herbs with which you can discharge your obligation for bitter herbs on Pesach. And actually, we should count them up. Are there 5? There's lettuce, chicory, wild chicory, picory, and sorry, yeah, there are 5. So we have 5 species of grain, and we've got 5 species of herb. So these 2 Mishnayot, the Mishnayot of the grain and the Mishnayot of the herbs, are indeed parallel mirror image Mishnayot. These are the vegetables that a person fulfills his obligation on at Pesach time. B'chazeret, uv'ulashin, uv'tamcha, uv'char chavina, uv'maror. So chazeret, well, most people actually say that's lettuce. With chicory, that's ulshin. The tamcha is some kind of wild chicory, or the Rambam says it's some kind of special bitter coriander, actually. The char chavina is translated as picridium, but I actually don't know what it is. And maror is, maror means bitter, but in this translation, it's a plant called sonchus. And I'm sorry I haven't had time to find you photographs of these, but we could find photographs of them. And the Mishnah is going to continue. They fulfill their obligation whether they're moist or dry. So we can have an old vegetable, a dried out vegetable, to fulfill our obligation on Pesach. Aval, this is really important. Lo kushin velo shlukin velo muvushalin. We can't preserve them or stew them or boil them. In other words, we have to eat these things raw. They could be a bit dry, but they're raw. And they combine to the size of an olive, which most people will say is about 25 mil, actually. So, about 25 mil. It's half. I mean, halachically, it's half an egg, and an egg is actually about 50 mil. So they combine to the size of an olive. That is to say that if you had different kinds of herbs, you could have a little bit of each kind of herb, and they would combine up to make the size of an olive, and you'd fulfill your obligation. And you can fulfill your obligation will be demai, u'maser rishon, shenitla truma. You can the same list, really. You can use demai, you can use first tithe from which truma has been separated, u'maser sheni, v'hekdesh sheniftu, and property that's been redeemed. Maybe I will stop there. We usually do 3 Mishnayot per day, but these are really quite fundamental and they're quite long. These 2 parallel Mishnayot about the grains and the herbs, and it's fascinating that they are mirror images one of the other. So maybe we will stop here and we'll learn about other issues, Bran, when we attack the next Mishnah.